The first mech in our 3-mech lance is a Malak Luminos. It's 30 tons, energy-based, and its strange feature is that it has a retractable blade. It's a celestial omni-mech with a built-in improved C3 and affiliated with the Word of Blake in the 3075-ish era. The second mech is a Preta Dominus. This is a larger 45-ton omni-mech. It also has like a retractable blade, and it's got more ER, medium lasers, more heat sinks. I mean, it's basically a 45-ton version of the previous mech. And to round it all off, in the back sits a CPLT C4. Just to remind you, that's got the twin LRM-20s and 2 small lasers. It sits way far in the back and acts as artillery. And all the pilots have been improved, pumped up a bit. Notably, the Catapult, instead of being a 4.5, is now a 2.5 to give an extra 2 bonus to targeting, primarily because it's going to be sniping from the back. So that's the original problem. Rather than pumping up the pilots, is there some minor tweak, like adding IC3 to the Catapult, that would make this lance better? So you want to try your hand at customizing a mech or vehicle. Well, you're in luck. We're going to go through that here. But first, you'll need a copy of this book. Fortunately, it also exists as a PDF, which is pretty convenient. Personally, I'm old school, so I like physical copies, but that's just my style. You'll also want to get a copy of the actual rule book. That's this thing, although I don't actually know if these are the most modern, up-to-date versions or not. And there are some significant errata to some of the battle value tables that one has to be aware of, specifically to the pilot adjustments. I tried a really simple mod. I just wanted to take a viewer's lance and mod it in a very slight way to improve it. That is, just add an IC3 to a Catapult that didn't have it. I mean, how hard could that possibly be? In fact, here's my mea culpa. I consider this, to me, the modern rules. I mean, this is the revised edition after all. In fact, I spent 20 years dead as a Battletech player. But that's a long story in itself. Basically, I gave all my mechs to a friend and all my stuff to a friend, hoping he would get into Battletech. He shelved it for 20 years. Then he gave it back to me just like a couple years ago. Now, a lot of stuff happened in between. Like, when I stopped, it was like clan invasion era. Then some weird stuff like the Jihad and Dark Ages occurred, and I actually know very little about that stuff. So, my thinking is kind of like a time warp back to the original 3025 Inner Sphere and the arrival of the clans. Part of the reason I wanted to get into these computer simulations was to kind of get back into the groove. And it's interesting, but I don't think the basic strategy has changed much since the old days, so a lot of it still applies. And now it's like you can get 3D printed dropships. It's like, wow, it's like you used to have to use a gray spray painted soccer ball. And heck, my old stuff is kind of worth a small fortune now, which is kind of cool in itself. But I did pick up a bunch of stuff too recently to kind of augment the old stuff, but I still have some of my original mechs. And I'm also pretty sure that had I not given it to a friend who just kind of stashed it away for 20 years, I'm pretty sure I would have kind of frittered it away or lost it or something in the interim. So I'm kind of glad it worked out that way. And what I have noticed is that I don't think anything's really changed. It's the same way of thinking, the same way of tactic, the same basic tactics and things still apply, even with all these newfangled rules and stuff, with a slight exception of the C3 network and ECM, which has changed things a little bit. Also, the tubes of the interwebs allow you to share and check out other people's knowledge. So actually, the tactical knowledge has just absolutely exploded, because back then you were kind of just stuck with whatever you'd figured out on your own. Okay, enough BS and reminiscing. Time to get to the mods. So how you do mods is just make sure the tonnage and the critical spaces still work. Then you have to figure out what the new battle value and the C-bills cost are, but the C-bills cost is kind of optional. And you don't need my help balancing the tonnage or the crit slots unless you're a dumbass, or you're a dumbass like myself who trusts Sarna or misremembers the weight or the crit slots and the equipment that a mech has. So the only thing you really have to work hard on is figuring out what the battle value is. The C-bills are relatively straightforward. You just add up the parts and then you adjust it with something called the chassis multiplier, which is based on your weight. And there's also some multipliers for things like whether you're an Omni or whether you have ferrofibrous armor and things like that. And the hardest part of the C-bills calculation is figuring out the engine and what the engine cost is. But I said this is going to be introductory customization, so this is more of a minor change to an existing design rather than a design from scratch type situation. So in order to do that, for a minor change, you have to focus on the battle value. For C-bills, you just find out what the changes are in the weapons and things like that you just did and multiply by the chassis multiplier, and everything else should be the same. But for battle value, it's much more complicated, and there's actually a long procedure to it. Fortunately, the book walks you through many worked out examples for the various mech and vehicle classes, so it kind of makes it bearable, but it's still difficult. In fact, the procedure is so convoluted that you kind of need the book. But the basic idea is you look up the battle value of the components in these tables, and then you have to calculate something called the heat efficiency, and you adjust your weapon's battle value based on that and based on how much ammo you have. And also you have these defense and offensive multipliers, which you scale your weapons versus your armor and engine on. Again, if you just make a minor change, it's not too bad, but you have to be careful regarding your heat generation versus your heat sinks, because that scales a lot of your weapons based on the heat efficiency. Then there's the components that don't actually have battle value themselves, but alter the battle value based on changes to your speed and things like that, such as like your engine. Your engine doesn't have battle value, but it creates a certain speed, and that speed alters your offensive and defensive multiplier. So your engine indirectly affects battle value, but not directly. Also, if you adjust the piloting skill, you have to do a final multiplication on the mech's battle value by these. So this is easy to use because you can just get a pre-canned standard mech and adjust the pilot with this table. I also heard or saw somewhere that this has been errataed. So now, because the multipliers are too high for the improved gunnery skills for what actually happens in tabletop, so I think the errata is to reduce the multiplication factors a little bit. And when I say a little bit, I mean a massive reduction. So instead of like a 1.3 factor to go from gunnery 4 to gunnery 3, I think it's been reduced to 1.1 or something. So it's really like a very significant change to the table. Basically, they screwed up by making the adjustments too high. This means the actual real table isn't actually listed anywhere that I know of. Maybe it's online somewhere. I think there's a BattleTech official website that has the current listings. There's also a program called Mech, which I know of, but I have actually never used, that apparently probably has all these tables updated and built into it, so you probably want to go there. One of our viewers challenged me to a mech match to check out targeting computers and pulse lasers and jumping generators, and I would be kind of excited, except if I haven't used mech before, but maybe this will be motivation to learn it. If you're in the Jihad era and you have a C3 network, then there's additional complication to basically multiply a C3 factor on top of everything, which is if you've got one mech only in your net, then you do no multiplication. But if you've got two mechs, you have to multiply it by an extra 10%. If you have three, you do 15%, and so on with 5% more per extra mech. So for a lance, you have to increase its battle value by 1.2. And if you were to fully network an entire company, you have to multiply it by 1.6, which is a horrendous load and probably not worth it. I think a good workaround for a company scale is to not actually do the last connection to connect your three subnets together. That way each one of your subnets only multiplies by 1.2 instead of having to multiply everything by 1.6. I don't know if that's legit or not, but I think it is. So I think you can have a company of 12 mechs that has 3 independent C3 nets of 4 mechs each. That way you win back a lot of battle value. There's actually also a force modifier, which I think no one ever uses, because it's actually illegal to say that your lance has a certain battle value, because that's not true. Your lance only has that battle value before you have an opponent. In fact, if you did a good job designing a lance to be 5,000 battle value, but your opponent happens to have a couple fewer mechs than you do in their lance, which is also 5,000 battle value, then suddenly your battle value gets pumped up above 5,000, and then you've failed to stay under the 5,000 limit. So if you wanted to follow this, you would basically have to intentionally underdesign all your lances to be under the target battle value, just in case the opponent had too few mechs. Because this is so convoluted and cockamamie, no one uses this. I mean, maybe in tournaments or something, but it's not really, I mean, battle value is meant for pickup games anyway, so it just kind of self-defeats itself in some ways. That's why no one does this. That being said, everyone uses, or a lot of people use, battle value to determine the size of their force. So when you go play some random person you've never played before, you have a roughly even matchup. Otherwise, you can have a ridiculous mismatch. It seems that everyone agrees on battle value before pilot skills and C3 nets are included. But once you include pilot skills and C3 nets, you start seeing house rules and modifications to battle value rules. Also, because we're going to be modifying a Jihad era C3 based lance here, we're going to want to know how the rules work. In fact, we're going to be modifying a Word of Blake lance. So how C3 works in Word of Blake is the C3 eyes, everything connects to everything else. And in order to determine the battle value, you basically just take all your networked units, multiply them by their piloting modifiers for their battle value, and then multiply by the network modifier to the battle value. And I would pretty much just ignore the force scale difference modifier because it's kind of a crummy rule. So for non-Wabi C3, it's a standard C3 masters and slaves. That works kind of like these diagrams. If you have a full company, you can network them in several ways, which are shown here. Note that a master can only talk to masters or slaves, but not combinations. So literally inside that mech in the middle, some of the masters are talking to the masters inside that same mech, just a different master. Now let's get back to the original problem. The original problem is a viewer had described their lance, which has two celestial mechs that have built-in IC3, and then they had a CPLT C4 Catapult, which is like a 3025 era type mech that does not have IC3 built in. And that was the problem. And they had to pump up their piloting and gunnery skills a lot in order to make their mechs work together well. Because the original Celestial mechs had IC3 on them and the Catapult does not, the Catapult doesn't get any benefit from targeting information unless you add IC3 to it, right? Now, the original Lance did have a lot of piloting improvements which increased the battle value of the various mechs. But otherwise, there was nothing particularly unusual about the design. Two frontline units and a backline catapult that would help out. So my line of thinking was, get rid of the pilot improvements and put this IC3 unit into the catapult, which would kind of eliminate some of the need for the piloting, the gunnery skill improvements in the catapult anyway. And then I would have enough battle value left over to add a fourth unit to the lance, possibly. And in particular, I was eyeing something called a Bola, which is a correct era, correct faction, Word of Blake troop transport that's got these really nice MML launchers on a turret. Or perhaps I could put some sort of a variant of an LRM launcher, or LRM carrier of some kind, maybe even a Word of Blake LRM carrier. And I could possibly make up for a battle value shortfall by maybe gimping the driver skill on either the Bola or the LRM carrier. I mean, after all, just don't flank and make turns, and then you should be okay. At least this is what I was thinking. Well, boy, did it become more complicated, and boy, was I wrong about some of the thinking. Now, it turns out the CPLT C4, there is no IC3 version of the Catapult that I know of. So you have to make a custom modification. So here's the weapons and armor loadout of the custom modification. The sum of the battle value and C-bills for the weapons in the middle of the screen, and at the bottom you can see the location of the ammo bins. Okay, so now let's quickly go through the battle value calculation. There's two parts. There's the defensive part and the offensive part. Then you add them together and you throw on the final multipliers. For the defensive part, you take how much armor you have, how much internal structure you have, and your gyro. And you have to look up a table with the gyro. Then you multiply by a speed factor for your defensive rating. Oh, and you also have to subtract off 15 points per ammo slot to compensate for the fact that you might blow up from crits as part of your defensive rating. Finally, in the end, you multiply by the lookup number, which happens to be 1.3 for this catapult. Then you have to take your sum of all your weapons battle values. That is, here I've got 371. You have to adjust it with something called the heat efficiency, based on how effective your heat sinks are. And then you have to multiply it by a speed factor from a lookup table. Once you combine the defensive and offensive values, that's kind of like your base battle value that you find in tables when you look up things in pages in books. Then you have to multiply those by the pilot and C3 net modifiers. So after some initial ignominy and embarrassment thinking the C4 had 13 heat sinks and that the IC3 was 2 tons instead of 2.5 tons, I finally fixed it up and then tried it. In fact, I went ahead and just took off 2 tons of armor. Each ton of standard armor is 16 bubbles on a mech sheet, so taking off 32 bubbles is quite a heavy loss of armor on the catapults, but it's going to stay at long range in the back anyway, so it's probably okay. Then I'm also going to drop a small laser off the C4 because I need that extra half ton. Also, I was thinking, I'm probably not going to engage anything with the small lasers anyway. And I might have a 4th unit to protect this or mutually defend against incoming small attackers. Here's the original lance with what I think are the errata correct piloting modifiers. Here's the attempted modded lance with the slightly overvalued CPLT C4 IC3 mech. I decided that it wasn't possible to add a 4th IC3 unit because it would pump up all the multipliers without really gimping all the gunnery and pilot skills, so I decided instead to swap out the catapult for other units. There's an attempt to replace the catapult with a LRM carrier Word of Blake variant. And here's replacing the catapult with a Bola with 2 LRM platoons. Adam Tony's original lance is the 4th from the bottom called Const 4K Wob Tony OG 3075. And the one to compare to is the one right under it, which is the basic IC3 version. And then the most bizarre thing ever happened. Instead of getting better, the Sims claimed the lance got worse. So sure, it went from 91% to 90% win rate. But it's still down instead of up. So you can probably guess that this made me go berserk, trying a variety of different alternatives. I tried Archangels, I tried double Pretas with a Deva, I did all kinds of stuff. Here's replacing the Malak with a Deva, but keeping all the pilots 4/5s. Here's no catapults, just a Preta, a Malak, and a Deva. This is a pretty good spread of mechs. And here's keep the original lance except convert the Malak into a Deva and use 4/5 pilots. But otherwise, no IC3 on the catapult. Finally, replace the catapult with a frickin' Archangel Communist, because it's like a ranged weapon, a 100-ton ranged unit, but keep all pilots 4/5. The Archangel variants did a little better, being like they got 94% win rates, but I mean, so did the one with the LRM platoons. So of course, eventually I found some combinations that were better, that were roughly the same battle value as the original battle group. But why did the original attempt with the IC3 on the catapult fail? Sure, I reduced the armor from 10 tons to 8 tons, and I got rid of one of the small lasers. But did that really change the game that much? I mean, these are basically ranged LRM boats. I mean, I even had some pro players that made some comments agreeing that the lance should obviously get better once you add IC3 to the catapults. But that's just not what happened. Now, part of it is that my AI is not as smart as a human player, so it's going to kind of suck with its tactics. But that's kind of not the main thing. Well, for example, whenever the Preta and the Malak run up to any Jihad-era group, they often get ECM jammed by a Guardian, and there goes the C3 net. Now, had I just kept all the pilot upgrades instead, especially on the catapults, then it wouldn't care about such things. It would just still get its elite shots. So the lesson for the day is you can do customization, and it is a lot of work, but you may not get as much bang per effort as you would expect. You might consider just changing the lance design instead and putting different mechs in. Or another way of looking at it is, if you've got a set of mechs that you really like, but the battle value of the game you're going into is significantly different than what they would add up to, it might be okay to just pump up the piloting skills to get up there. Now the part that you really have been waiting for, though you didn't know about it. Now it's time for battle sims. I mean, you gotta see how this performs in an actual battle. Then I was thinking, I've had other viewers submit mech designs before, so then I just kind of cobbled together a lance that's roughly the same battle value. That is Mike Keegan's Riflemen. I'm just gonna see what happens if these riflemen go up against this jihadi lance. The main feature of the Keegan Riflemen is they've got maxed out armor, lots and lots of heat sinks, lots and lots of medium lasers and SRM6s, and everything else is stripped off of them. So they tend to be slow, but have a couple jump jets because they want to minimize the engine size just so they can fit more medium lasers and more heat sinks. Originally, I was gonna hit these with some warriors, but that would be kind of unfair and boring because the warriors would just sit out of range because these things only have range 9 weapons. So who do you think is gonna win? Word of Blake or the Keegan Rifleman? In order to make this as interesting as possible, I did not check out the winner beforehand, so I just started taking the results screens and verbalizing what's happening to them here in this video without knowing the conclusion until the end. Okay, turn 1. We're just barely at the max range of LRMs, so some LRMs get popped off. But nothing special seems to happen, and all the Keegan Riflemen seem to target the Malak Luminous. It seems like everybody's targeting the second Rifleman, at least the Word of Blake side is targeting the second Rifleman, and for some reason not the first one. Maybe the random collision avoidance algorithm pushed it out closer or something. It seems like some SRMs have hit the Malak, and a whole crapload of lasers and at least one PPC have hit that second Rifleman, so some exchange of fire is occurring successfully. Looks like the overall damage isn't too bad yet, but it looks like the Preta got touched by something too that I must have missed. This time it looks like a whole bunch of lasers are going for the Preta. The Malak is being left alone and someone's aiming SRMs at the catapults. Best case scenario for the Word of Blake lance, because there's no ECM. The Keegan Riflemen are a third succession war era lance, so they don't have any ECM. So far, damage is spread fairly evenly around Team Blake. Perhaps the Malak is a little worse off than the others, and the Riflemen seem to have absorbed most of their damage on the first and second units. Okay, by turn 4, it's starting to look pretty obvious that the Riflemen seem to have an advantage, and 2 of the Word of Blake pilots have already been injured. I mean, just take a look at these mech diagrams. I mean, it looks like the Blake side is worse for wear with more X's. Okay, the next turn, it looks like the Malak and the Catapult are trying to back off as much as possible, and the Riflemen are trying to get up to point-blank range. It looks like both the Malak and the Catapults are running hot, and the Malak has actually fallen down, probably from massive damage. Okay, this is now turn 6. Some serious action going on. The Malak just takes vast barrages of lasers, and I think it's destroyed. It looks like the Riflemen just all focus fired on that Malak and just obliterated it, because they're all kind of hot, which usually happens only if a mech senses that it can kill another mech, then it just kind of goes all out. It looks like the Riflemen are now turning their attention to the Preta, and the Preta is bombarding the first Rifleman. I also see something interesting here. One of the hits says MG or Special. That's because I used the code for the machine gun also for special attacks, like with the blade. So I think the Preta has actually used its blade on one of the riflemen. It must be at point blank range. The Preta and the Catapults are not looking that great, but the riflemen are kind of hot and shut down or cooling or attempting to restart their reactor. So at the end of turn 8, it looks like the Preta has finally absorbed a vast barrage of laser fire, and it looks like it's going down too. The rifleman still looks okay, though it is trying to keep at a distance, and it still has some ammo. It looks like the Catapult has managed to kind of make a distance from itself to the rifleman, and is bombarding one rifleman with both its LRM-20s, and it managed to get 7 cluster hits out of its maximum 8 clusters out of its 2 LRM-20s. Looks like the Word of Blake Catapult is hanging on and still doing okay, but the riflemen have closed in a little bit, and 2 of them are in range and 2 of them are out of range with their weapons. The Catapult seems to be down to only 7 and 5 shots respectively with its 2 LRM-20 launchers. I don't know if that's really enough for it to win anymore. It looks like one of the riflemen has actually closed to point-blank range with the Catapult, and the Catapult is fighting with its small laser, with its 2 small lasers because it's not the IC3 version, and the riflemen are bombarding with their SRMs. One of the Catapult's legs is about to fall off, and it's also running hot. The riflemen are generally in better shape. Finally, turn 12. The Catapult falls under a barrage of SRMs and laser fire. Well, the Wobbists got taken out, but the riflemen are a bit beat up. Wait a second. What the hell? Those are not Blakeists. Those are Capellans in those Omni-mechs. It's like I forgot to activate the house flag to be Blakeist, and it randomly picked the Capellans against House Merrick. Well, maybe the Capellans stole those mechs from the Blakeists somehow. No wonder they lost, because they just weren't wearing all their implants and stuff, and they just didn't know how to use their IC3 correctly or something.